The last thing Mara Sen did before the Veth came was plant a tree. Not ceremonially, not with speeches or cameras or the kind of careful wait that people give to last things when they know they are last. She did it at 4 in the morning in the dark, with her hands already bleeding from the wire fencing she'd been cutting for 3 hours. She pressed a river-red gum seedling, no bigger than her forearm, barely a root system, still in its nursery sleeve, into a hole she dug with a trowel and the blunt end of a broken fence post. Covered it with soil that smelled like salt and old water, pressed her palms flat over it for a moment, feeling the cold of the earth against the cuts on her hands, the particular intimacy of broken skin against soil. Then she walked back to the facility and made herself a cup of tea, and watched the invasion start on every screen they had. She did not go back to check on that tree for a long time. She thought about it sometimes during those early months, not obsessively, just the way you think about something you've started that you can't check on, the way you plant seeds and then walk away and have to trust the dark. The Veth arrived the way all catastrophic things arrive, faster than anyone was ready for and slower than everyone always says afterward, in the safety of looking back. First, the signal anomalies, which the astronomers argued about for 2 weeks while the rest of the scientific community waited to see who was right. Then the objects, not ships, exactly. The word ship implies something built for travel, and the Veth constructs were built for something else entirely. They were substrate processors. The travel was incidental. They went where the minerals were and they ate as they went, and Earth had minerals in abundance, and humans had been kind enough to pre-process a great deal of it already, concentrating metals and polymers in cities and industrial corridors that the Veth could simply absorb. The Veth were, by the standards of the cosmos, neither unusual nor particularly sophisticated as civilizations went. They were old, genuinely old, the kind of old that humans had barely begun to have frameworks for, and they were efficient, and they had built their efficiency over millions of years of stripping worlds and moving on, the way a fire burns through a field and continues. They did not hate what they processed. They did not love it. They categorized it and extracted it and moved on. What surprised the Veth, what their advanced models had apparently failed to account for, was how loud humans were about dying. Every civilization the Veth had previously substrate processed had either surrendered in silence or simply never developed the communication infrastructure to organize any meaningful resistance before the extraction was complete. Humans, inexplicably, spent the first 6 days of the occupation broadcasting on every frequency available, in every language ever recorded, sending messages to each other and to empty space and to the Veth themselves, as if talking could stop it. They sent music and scientific papers and children's drawings and recipes and arguments about politics and confessions of love and lists of every species of bird that had ever lived on Earth, as if an inventory of beautiful things could make a destroyer pause. It could not stop it, but it did slow it down. The Veth were, in their biology, highly sensitive to complex information signals. Their neural clusters, distributed throughout their thoraxes in a web of electrochemical nodes, rather than localized like mammalian brains, processed external data continuously and involuntarily. The architecture that made them effective substrate processors also made them, in certain conditions, overwhelmed by dense information environments. Humans screaming at each other across radio bands created a kind of static in the Veth command structures, not debilitating, not even particularly uncomfortable. The way background noise is not uncomfortable until it isn't background anymore, but present, an interference pattern they had not modeled and could not fully filter on their initial passes. This was what gave some humans time to run. Not many, enough. Mara Sen ran south. She was 34 years old, a xenobotanist by training and a seed archivist by necessity, a job title that hadn't existed when she'd started her career, but which the climate crisis had slowly made as essential as any other kind of preservation work. and she ran south from the Melbourne research facility with three things: a hard case drive containing 17 years of genetic sequencing data and ecosystem mapping, a field kit with 2 weeks of compressed rations, and the particular kind of calm that descends on people who have already accepted the worst and are simply trying to manage the details. Her particular kind of calm looked to most people like cold-bloodedness. It wasn't. It was grief that had been processed very quickly and then set aside, not because she was unfeeling, but because feelings were not, at this moment, useful, and she had always been someone who moved toward usefulness under pressure. She had cried once, for about 12 minutes, in a stairwell, very early on the second day. Then she'd washed her face and gone back to copying data. She did not run alone. There were 11 of them initially, 4 researchers from her department, 2 water treatment engineers from the facility itself, a maintenance technician named Sven who had been there for 20 years and knew every drain and cable run in the building, a GP who had been visiting for a conference and simply never left when the roads stopped being safe, and a secondary school student named Demi who had been doing a work placement and who had called his mother twice on the first day and not gotten through, and then quietly stopped trying and started helping with the equipment inventory instead. And George, who was not a researcher or an engineer or anything he had a simple title for. He had been a radio hobbyist and a bushfire communication volunteer and a person who showed up. And Mara found herself understanding very quickly that showing up was the rarest and most valuable skill on offer. They moved on foot mostly, sometimes by bicycle, through a landscape that was changing in ways that made Mara's botanist eyes ache. The Veth substrate processors didn't just extract, they sterilized. Whatever they passed over, they left behind a kind of chemical silence. Soil pH altered to something near industrial runoff. Seed banks in the topsoil destroyed. The bacterial communities in the earth, the invisible architecture everything else depended on, the mycorrhizal networks and the nitrogen-fixing colonies, and the microorganisms that turned dead matter back into living soil. Simply gone, like someone had run a magnet over a hard drive and erased the operating system while leaving the hardware intact. The land still looked like land, but nothing would grow in it, not for a long time, perhaps not ever without intervention. She had seen this in her research, not from the Veth, from humans, degraded land, salinity creep. The kind of soil damage that centuries of wrong agriculture could produce, or decades of industrial contamination, or simply the long, slow consequence of treating the ground as a resource to be drawn down rather than a system to be maintained. She had spent her career studying how to reverse it, how to inoculate dead ground with living biology, how to choose the right first-mover species to begin the slow work of soil rehabilitation, how to encourage root networks that would, over years and decades, rebuild what had been lost. She knew what it looked like when the ground died. She knew it could be reversed. That knowledge became the most dangerous thing she carried, more dangerous than the hard case drive, more dangerous than anything else she could have grabbed in those 12 minutes before she ran. The country south of Melbourne was not empty. Other groups had had the same instinct: get away from the population centers, get away from the industrial infrastructure the Veth were targeting, find places that were low value by Veth extraction standards. Mara's group was not the only cluster of survivors moving through the outer suburban and rural corridor. They encountered others sometimes, and the encounters were cautious and brief, and usually resulted in the exchange of information rather than supplies. What have you seen? What direction did it come from? What did the advanced processing teams do to the soil east of the highway? They learned to read the landscape the way Mara had learned to read it in her research, as a map of processes, not a backdrop. The areas the Veth had fully processed were identifiable by the change in air quality as much as anything, the particular flat chemical smell of sterilized ground, not unpleasant exactly, just empty, the way a room smells when it's been too thoroughly cleaned of everything that lived in it. The transition zones were harder. The places the Veth were actively working had a different sound, not quite mechanical, not quite biological, something in between that Mara's nervous system categorized as wrong in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She cataloged it anyway. She had a notebook, an actual paper notebook, because batteries ran out and screens broke and paper, in her experience, kept working, and she noted everything she observed as they moved. Soil conditions where she could get a sample, plant survival rates in the transition zones, the way certain deep-rooted species seemed to persist longer than surface-dependent ones, the particular geometry of Veth extraction paths, which tended to follow the same logic as efficient mining, maximum coverage with minimum redundancy, a honeycomb logic that left predictable gaps. The gaps were where things survived. She wrote this down. She didn't know yet why it felt important, but it did. They found the Altona site on the 43rd day. Most of the others didn't understand why Mara stopped there. It looked like nothing, a low rise above a defunct water treatment facility, surrounded by wire fencing that had been partially flattened by something large moving through it at some point in the past. 5 irregular shapes that might have been old infrastructure, or might have been natural. You couldn't tell at a distance. George said it looked like a place that had been forgotten, which Mara said was exactly why they should look closer. Up close you could tell. 5 spiral forests, circling inward to outward, planted in geometric sequence. River red gums and drooping she-oaks and salt paperbark, planted by a woman named Agnes Deans in 1998 as part of an international land art event, in the shape of 5 concentric rings, each ring a different species density, each species chosen to create a stacked pyramid silhouette when the trees reached full maturity. The design had nearly died once before. The millennium drought had taken half of them in the early 2000s, and the soil at the outer boundary of the site was wrong for the species planted there, too saline, too compacted, and the trees that hadn't died of thirst had died of salt and the wrong ground chemistry. But they'd been restored. Hands had come back to them 17 years after the original planting in 2015, with new rootstock and improved understanding of the site's hydrology, and they'd been coaxed back. They stood now, not tall, not magnificent, not the way forests in old photographs stood, but alive. Scraggly and salt-adapted and asymmetric and deeply, stubbornly, unreasonably alive, the way things are alive when they have survived something that should have killed them. Mara stood at the edge of the outermost spiral and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a name for. The feeling of recognition, maybe, of looking at something you know from the inside out. Behind her, George said quietly, "What are we looking at?" "Art," Mara said. "And a root system that goes down 4 meters in some places." She paused, calculating. The Veth extraction models prioritize high-density industrial substrate. This site is classified as green space and water treatment infrastructure. The soil chemistry is, she stopped, wrong for them, variable. The salinity gradients and the water table variation would confuse their extraction sequencing. So they'd skip it, he said. They'd deprioritize it. Not skip, but deprioritize. She was still looking at the spirals. The she-oaks were moving in the morning wind, their fine-needled branches catching the light in a way that was specifically Australian, the kind of quality of light and motion you recognized if you had grown up under these skies and had spent years studying what grew in them. I'm thinking that someone who loved this country enough to plant 5,000 trees in geometric spirals in the middle of a sewage treatment plant knew something about persistence that we could use. She didn't say the rest. She didn't know yet how to say it, but she felt it the way she sometimes felt the shape of a research conclusion before the data was fully in, the outline of something large, traced in the dark. They stayed at the Altona site for 417 days. Not hiding exactly. Hiding implies a passivity they didn't have. They were careful about fires and light and noise, and they moved within the site's perimeter rather than outside it, and they avoided the kinds of activity that might read, from a Veth signal perspective, as population density worth processing. But within those constraints they were intensely, exhaustingly active. The treatment plant buildings still had partial structural integrity. George spent the first 2 weeks assessing them, and another 2 weeks making them more intact, salvaging materials from the surrounding area with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent years preparing for the kinds of emergencies that most people hoped would never come. Sven, who had worked in building maintenance for 2 decades and had the practical knowledge base to prove it, worked alongside him, and the two of them together managed to produce something that was comfortable in no conventional sense of the word, but was functional, weatherproof, and defensible, which were the 3 things that mattered. The GP, her name was Dr. Adisa, and she had the quality that the best doctors have of treating the situation rather than the diagnosis, established what she called the medical corner and what everyone else called Adisa's kingdom, a section of the treatment building where she kept her supplies with a precision that made Mara feel better about the world every time she saw it. Organized, labeled, rationed, inventoried in a small notebook that Adisa updated every 3 days with the particular satisfaction of someone for whom order is not a preference but a philosophy. Demi, the work placement student who had been here when the world changed, adapted faster than almost anyone else in the group. He was 17, which meant he had come of age in a world already characterized by crisis management, and the psychological infrastructure he'd built to handle that translated with more fluency than Mara would have expected to this. He was quiet and observant, and almost never said things that weren't useful. She started bringing him with her when she went to work in the forest. The hardcase drive she'd carried out of Melbourne contained not just sequencing data, but a complete map of the Altona forest's root architecture, compiled over years of ground-penetrating radar surveys as part of a land art conservation study she had joined in her early career, before xenobotany had become her primary focus. She had been part of that study because she was interested in how root systems in low-diversity plantings develop complexity over time, and the Dean spirals had been a perfect test case, a controlled planting of known species in known geometry, with detailed records of the original installation, in a site that was monitored but largely undisturbed. She had spent 2 field seasons at the Altona site with ground-penetrating radar equipment, mapping the subsurface structure, building a 3-dimensional picture of what was happening below the soil surface that the trees overhead gave no indication of. What she had found was not what the conservation study had expected. Root systems in plantings of multiple species were known to interlace over time. This was well documented, and one of the arguments conservationists used against monoculture planting. But the interlacing at Altona had gone significantly further than the literature would have predicted for the species mix, and the time elapsed. The roots of the 3 species had grown not just adjacent to each other, but through each other in some places, sharing what appeared, based on the chemical profiling her team had done, to be not just mechanical space, but active chemical communication. Water gradients being signaled across species boundaries, stress responses in one spiral affecting growth behavior in adjacent spirals. The mycorrhizal network, the fungal threads that colonize root systems and extend their reach, had developed a structure that her colleague, on seeing the mapping data, had described as, and this was a quote she had never forgotten, uncomfortably organized for something that had no brain. The forest had grown past its own design. The 5 spirals had become one organism with 5 visible manifestations and one invisible network. She had written a paper about it. It had been published in a mid-tier journal and read by a handful of specialists, and then set aside, the way most research is set aside, for later. There was always going to be time for later. She pulled the paper up from the drive on the 93rd night, lying in the dark with a headlamp fading slowly toward uselessness overhead, and she read it 3 times. Then she put it away and lay still for a long time, listening to the salt-adapted trees outside, the particular soft percussion of sheoak needles in wind, which is unlike the sound any other tree makes, and which she had always found irrationally comforting. Then she got up and started digging. She did not tell the others what she was doing, not at first. Not because she didn't trust them. She did, increasingly and deeply, in the way you trust people who have demonstrated their quality under conditions that strip away everything performative. George, who woke up before anyone and checked the perimeter and never said anything about doing it. Priya, the former work placement student turned de facto lab assistant, who had a memory for chemical formulas that was unusual enough to be worth specifically noting in any other context, and here was simply invaluable. Adisa, who kept track of everyone's health with a thoroughness that went well beyond the physical. Sven, who could fix anything with components from other broken things, and who did so without any visible sense that this was remarkable. She didn't tell them because she didn't yet have language for what she was doing. The idea was too large and too strange, and too dependent on things she could feel but not yet prove, and she had always had the scientist's particular reluctance to speak the hypothesis before the experimental design was solid. She had been burned by that before. Not here. There was no career to protect here, no peer review to survive, but the habit was structural, built into her at a level that her conscious mind didn't fully control. What she did instead was ask them to help with things she could explain. The soil restoration. Starting with the basic inoculant cultures she could grow from samples taken from the existing forest root zone, bacteria, primarily, the nitrogen fixers and the decomposers, the invisible organisms that were the actual foundation of anything that grew. The careful hand pollination of the sheoaks, because the insects that would normally do it were largely gone now, the veth extraction having disrupted the insect populations along with everything else. The water table mapping, which George helped her with using improvised instruments that he admitted produced data of dubious accuracy, but that she said was better than no data, which was the current alternative. The mycorrhizal cultivation was what she was actually doing. Building a consortium, a community of fungal species selected from the existing network's population, cultured on improvised growth media, modified using the sequencing tools she'd packed in the hard case, and then reintroduced to the soil in a sequence designed to expand the network's coverage, and more specifically, to enhance certain properties of the signals it was capable of carrying. She knew what she wanted the network to do. She had known it. She realized later, since the 93rd night, since reading her own paper 3 times in the dark. The knowing had arrived before the language, which sometimes happened with ideas that were large enough. She wanted it to speak. Not in any metaphorical sense. The forest already spoke, had always spoken, in the chemical language of root-to-root signaling, a language that had been evolving for longer than any human language, and that was, in certain key biochemical respects, not entirely unlike the electrochemical signaling architecture that the veth command cast used for their distributed neural processing. That was the thing she hadn't said in her paper, because it hadn't been relevant to the paper's subject. But she had noted it, in the margins of the ground-penetrating radar data, in a shorthand she developed for observations that were interesting but not yet useful. The chemical profile of the Altona mycorrhizal network signaling compounds had an unusual structural overlap with the published analysis of veth neurochemistry. Analysis that had been released in the first frantic weeks of the occupation by research teams trying to understand the biology of what they were facing. It wasn't the same. It was analogous, convergent, like finding on 2 different continents 2 unrelated species that had evolved the same solution to the same problem. Mara Sen had spent her career studying convergent evolution in plant root systems. She knew what it meant when two different organisms arrived at the same solution independently. It meant the solution was good. It meant the underlying logic was sound. It meant that, under the right conditions, the two systems might recognize each other. Priya found out first. Not because Mara told her, because Priya worked in the improvised lab with her long enough to start asking questions that the visible work didn't fully answer. And when she asked the questions directly, she got direct answers. Priya had that quality of making not telling feel more complicated than telling. "The fungal cultures you're modifying," Priya said one afternoon, looking at the sequencing data on the drive screen. "The signal compound you're selecting for." She paused. "This isn't just soil restoration." "No," Mara said. "It's also..." Priya looked at the comparison file she'd apparently pulled up without Mara noticing. "Veth neurochemistry adjacent. Not identical, the structural overlap is 23% in the primary signal pathway. I saw it." Priya set the screen down. "What does 23% do?" "Resonance," Mara said. "Not control, not disruption, just recognition. The fungal signal registers as signal to a Veth neural cluster, not comprehensible signal, but signal. The way static on a frequency is still a frequency. And if something with a Veth distributed neural architecture spent enough time in a soil environment saturated with this compound." Mara looked at her. "The distributed architecture would try to process it. The way it processes everything, not through a central node but across the whole system. And what the whole system would encounter, distributed, everywhere it touched ground, would be a very large, very old, very patient communication network with no command node and no hierarchy. And their architecture can't process non-hierarchical structure," Priya said slowly. "It can process it," Mara corrected. "It just classifies it as the dominant signal in the environment, because there's no apex. Because to a system built around dominant-subordinate signaling, something with no hierarchy reads as," she paused, "as above the hierarchy." Priya was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to make the ground bow them," she said. It wasn't quite right, but it was close enough. And it was the kind of formulation that Mara recognized as the point at which she needed to tell the others. She told them in pieces over 3 evenings. She told George first, because George needed to understand things before he could function around them, and he listened with the focused stillness that she had come to identify as his version of taking something seriously. He didn't ask many questions. The questions he asked were engineering questions: coverage, propagation rate, the logistics of expanding the inoculant distribution across the site and potentially beyond it. Demi, when she told him, was quiet for a long time and then said, "So the forest is going to tell them they're part of it?" "Yes," Mara said. "Even though they're not." She thought about it. "I'm not sure that distinction is as clear as it sounds. If you spend enough time in a soil environment and the soil environment has been building a network for long enough," she stopped. "The Veth have been in this soil. Their substrate teams move on ground. Their command cast sets down when they stop, their ventral surfaces in contact with the earth. They've been leaving their biochemical traces in the soil for months. The network has been encountering those traces and responding to them. There's already a connection." She paused. "I'm just amplifying it, making it legible." Adisa asked how long. "The network coverage currently extends about 12 kilometers from this site," Mara said. "At the current expansion rate, I expect it to reach 40 kilometers within the next 6 months. The signal density at the epicenter, here, at the first spiral, will be significantly higher than at the edges. And the Veth command cast needs to be here, at the epicenter, for the effect to be significant." "Yes. So this requires them to come here." "It requires them to come to this sector. The substrate operations in the surrounding area have been experiencing," she chose her words, "coordination difficulties, for the last 8 months. Their command signals are technically intact. Their personnel are technically functional, but they keep making small non-optimal choices, deferring to each other, taking longer routes. Resting when rest isn't operationally indicated. She met Addis's eyes. The command cast reads that as subordinate dysfunction. When subordinate dysfunction is widespread enough, the Alpha King comes to assess personally. The room was quiet. "You've been inducing the dysfunction," George said. It wasn't a question. "The network has been inducing it. I've been maintaining the network." She paused. "There's a difference." George nodded slowly. "Is there?" It was also not a question. The Veth Alpha King arrived at Altona on the 942nd day. He came with a contingent of 12 command cast, which the survivor networks had said was unusual. Most field visits involved 4 or 5. The larger number could mean many things, Mara told herself, and proceeded to not think about most of them. The passive scanner George had rebuilt from salvaged radio components picked up the advanced signal at 4:47 a.m., and by the time the light was sufficient to see by, they had been awake for 3 hours and were as ready as they were going to be. Mara stood at the center of the outermost spiral. She had put on her cleanest field jacket, which was not very clean, and she had washed her face and hands with the water they kept back for exactly such non-survival purposes as dignity, and she had pulled her hair back, and she had then stood in the mirror that Sven had salvaged from a bathroom in the north wing and looked at herself for a while. What she saw was a woman who had been outside for nearly 1,000 days, who had soil permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, who had developed the particular posture of someone who spent a lot of time crouching, who looked older than 34 but not in any way that seemed like a problem. She looked like someone who had been doing something for a long time. She looked like someone who was right. She had told the others to stay inside. They had refused, all 11 of them, the refusal phrased in 11 different ways but carrying the same essential message. "We have spent 1,000 days together, and we are not inside while you are outside for this." She had not argued past a certain point, partly because they were right and partly because she did not, if she was being honest with herself, want to be alone for it. They stood behind her at the entrance to the forest. George, then Priya, then Demi and the others, in the informal clustered arrangement they developed over months that wasn't quite a formation but had the quality of one. The quality of people who have learned to move and stand together without needing to discuss it. The Alpha King came from the north, following what Mara had identified 8 months ago as the primary Veth transit corridor through this sector. She saw him before she could make out details, a mass and a motion, the particular flowing reorganizing movement of a Veth command cast organism crossing terrain, and then details resolved. He was larger than the command cast she'd observed at distance before. Darker. The sensory filaments trailing from his anterior surface were longer and more numerous, the mark of age in the Veth, she'd read, the accumulation of sensory infrastructure over time. He stopped 15 meters from her. His command casts spread behind him and to the sides, their natural formation, and even from here Mara could see that they were wrong, not in any gross way, but the formation was slightly too loose. The spacing between them slightly larger than optimal. The positioning of their sensory filaments already beginning to drift toward the ground, rather than maintaining the elevated scanning position that command cast maintained in unfamiliar terrain. The Alpha King's own filaments had oriented toward the trees. Not toward her, toward the trees. She felt something she didn't name. He communicated in the Veth fashion, not words, not sound in any range she could process, but a shift in the bioluminescent patterning of his dorsal surface, and a compression of low-frequency signal that George's scanner registered as a spike. The meaning, based on everything the survivor networks had compiled about Veth communication in the months of observation since the occupation began, was approximately, "What is this?" Not a question, a demand for data. She had no translation device. She had spent 1,000 days preparing for this, and she still had no translation device, because building one wasn't possible with what they had, and she had made her peace with that. She had her voice and her body language and the ground under his feet. She said in English, because there was nothing else, "You walked into the wrong forest." The filaments swung to her. "You thought you were coming to find an insurgency," she said. Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "Humans coordinating against your operations. Command structure you could identify and destroy. You're good at that." She held his sensory attention without looking away from it, which was approximately the human equivalent of meeting eyes in her best understanding of Veth body language. "But we don't have a command structure anymore. You broke it. You were very thorough." She paused. "We have something else." She gestured at the trees. Not dramatically. The way you gesture at something you've been working on for a long time, a motion that's more pointing out than presenting. "This forest was planted by a woman who believed you could make something live in ground that had been given up on," Mara said. "She didn't build it like you build things. She didn't extract. She didn't command. She put seeds in the ground and she waited, and she came back when the trees died, and she put more seeds in and she waited again. The trees grew past their own design. They stopped being 5 separate plantings and started being one thing with 5 visible parts and 1 invisible part, under the ground, connecting everything." She could feel the network underfoot. She always could now, had been able to since a few months into the work, the faint electrochemical suggestion of something moving through water and root, the way you feel weather before you see it. "I've been expanding that invisible part for 2 years. You've been in it since you arrived in this sector." The Alpha King was completely still. Behind him, 3 of his command cast had lowered slightly. Not fully down, they were still standing, still capable of immediate action, but lowered. Their filaments were on the ground. "The network has been talking to you," Mara said. "Not in any language you have a framework for, not commands, not hierarchical signals, just connection. Just the oldest communication system on this planet, which is, I am alive. I am here. I am made of the same world you are made of. Come be part of it." The Alpha King moved. 1 step to the side. In Veth body language, which Mara had studied with the focused desperation of someone whose life and the lives of her people depended on approximate understanding. A lateral step by a command-cast organism in a confrontational situation indicated something she had never expected to see: uncertainty. Physical hesitation in a dominant organism. His dorsal surface was flickering now in the rapid, complex pattern associated with large-scale distributed processing, every neural node in his body firing simultaneously. His sensory filaments reached the ground. She saw them make contact. She saw the change in his bioluminescence, not the rapid processing flicker, but something slower, something that spread rather than pulsed, a quality of light she'd never seen described in any of the observer reports she'd read. She had no name for it and would not find one for a long time. Around him, his 12 command casts did the same. One by one, their filaments went to the ground, and one by one the distributed processing flicker spread through them, the same slow spreading light. The Alpha King's entire ventral surface contacted the earth. It was not a fall. It was not a collapse. It was a bow, the most complete physical submission possible in Veth body language, which she knew because she had read everything anyone had ever compiled about Veth body language, and this was the one gesture that had only ever been described in theory, in the context of Veth interactions with each other. The absolute subordination that a Veth organism made only to a signal it classified as unconditionally dominant. He was bowing to the ground. He was bowing to the forest. He was bowing to 11 people standing at the entrance to a spiral of salt-adapted eucalyptus trees that had survived a drought and an alien invasion, and the wrong soil and everything the world could throw at them by the simple method of growing their roots together, deep, where nothing could reach. Behind Mara, Demi made a sound that she recognized after a moment as a laugh, not the sound of finding something funny, but the sound of a fact becoming real. George was silent in the way that George was silent when he was feeling something large. Priya made a single sharp sound, contained, and then was still. The Alpha King stayed down for 11 minutes. Mara counted. When he rose, his filaments were still trailing against the soil, still connected, still picking up signal from the mycorrhizal network that had spent 2 years learning to speak to anything with distributed neural architecture. He turned and looked at her, his sensory arrays fully oriented, the equivalent of full attention, and she met it, held it. She didn't know what he saw. She didn't need to know. He turned and led his command cast away from the spiral. None of them looked back. The survivor networks took weeks to fully believe the reports. George had been running the scanner and had logged the electromagnetic signatures of arrival and departure, and the signal analysis was unambiguous. 12 command cast and 1 Alpha King, on site for 47 minutes, departed in non-aggressive configuration, no extraction activity, no scan protocols. When they sent the data through the relay network that still flickered, patchy and improvised, across the southeastern corridor, the response was a silence that lasted 6 hours, and then a torrent of questions that lasted 3 days. Mara wrote back. She wrote everything: the root network, the mycorrhizal consortium, the signal architecture, the biochemical resonance with Veth distributed neurology, the 2 years of cultivation work, the expansion of the network's coverage. She wrote it with the precision of someone who wanted the record to be clear, who understood that what she was describing would need to be reproducible to matter. She wrote it for a long time, and at the end she added, "This is not a weapon. I want to be precise about that because the temptation will be to use it as one, and I understand that temptation, and I am asking clearly that we resist it. The Alpha King and his command cast will recover full autonomous function once they are far enough from the network's signal density. We have not trapped them. We have not controlled them. We have not defeated them in any military sense. What we have is a conversation, and what the conversation says is, this planet is connected in ways your models did not account for, and if you remain long enough in the connected world will become part of you whether you intend it or not. That is not a threat. It is a description of how living systems work. We can build more forests. We can plant more of them slowly in ground that has been given up on, in the geometry that carries signal most efficiently. We can do what Agnes Deans did in 1998, put seeds in damaged ground and come back to them and put more seeds in and wait. Over years, over decades, over the kind of time that forests require, which is longer than the kind of time that militaries require, and longer than the kind of time that civilizations that think only about extraction require, and it is precisely that length of time that makes it effective. The Veth cannot process something with no apex, no subordinate, no command. They will keep encountering the network as dominant because to a dominant system, the absence of hierarchy reads as above the hierarchy. And being part of something above the hierarchy, even a Veth Alpha King, eventually, does what you do when you are part of something. You bow to it. That is all I have done. I have made the oldest communication system on this planet speak a little more loudly and waited for something to listen. She sent it. Then she went outside. The Sheoks were putting out new growth. She had noticed it starting 3 weeks ago, and she had been trying to stay methodical about it, trying not to read into early growth signals what she wanted to see rather than what was actually there. Standing here now, in the morning light after the longest 47 minutes of her life, she let herself feel what it meant. New growth. The outer ring of the first spiral, the one closest to the treatment plant boundary, where the soil was most saline, and where the trees had always struggled most, was producing new growth at the crown. Fine new shoots, pale green against the older dark foliage, the color that young growth is before it hardens and darkens into the specific gray-green of salt-adapted eucalyptus. They were too young to be robust. They could still be killed by another drought, Another year of wrong conditions, any number of things that could go wrong. They were growing anyway. This was the thing about trees that Mara had come to understand over the course of her career, and that she had come to feel, rather than just understand, over the course of the last 1,000 days. They did not assess probability. They did not model risk. They did not decide whether conditions were optimal before committing to growth. When the conditions allowed it, they grew. When conditions killed them, they died. When other trees died and released resources into the soil, those resources went to the roots of the survivors, and the survivors grew further. The forest as a whole was not optimizing individual survival. It was optimizing collective persistence, the way something does when it has no individual perspective, only the whole. The most feared alpha king in this sector of the planet had bowed to a grove of salt-adapted eucalyptus, planted next to a sewage treatment plant, by a woman who believed that living things should be where other living things had been. He had not bowed to Mara. She was clear about this. She had built the thing he bowed to, but she was not the thing, and she could not receive what was owed to the thing, and she did not want to. She wanted what Agnes Deans had wanted when she pressed seeds into wrong soil in 1998, not a monument to herself, but a place where things kept growing. A system that would outlast its maker. A network that would expand past its own design and find connections that nobody had planned and speak to things that no one had anticipated it speaking to. She pressed her palms flat against the ground. Cold, salt damp. The familiar texture of this specific soil, which she knew as well by now as she knew the texture of her own hands. Under it, 40 square kilometers of connected intelligence that had no center and no command, that had been building itself for 25 years before she arrived and would continue building itself for as long as the conditions allowed, which was potentially, given what she now knew about its resilience, given what it had survived, given what it was doing to the Veth extraction operations across the sector, a very long time. She thought about Agnes Deans. She thought about the drought that had killed half these trees and the human hands that came back to restore them. She thought about Demi's father, who had said the smallest things were the most important, and about Demi's careful handwriting in the notebooks, recording the bacterial culture data with a precision that would outlast both of them. She thought about George's pre-dawn perimeter checks and Priya's chemical formula memory and Addis's organized medical corner and Sven's endless patient fixing of things with other broken things. She thought about the 11 of them, scattered and reconnected and still here. You didn't build a forest. She had always known that academically, intellectually, from the first lecture she'd ever attended on restoration ecology. You couldn't build one. You could prepare the ground. You could plant. You could return when it died and plant again. You could spend your life learning the conditions that allowed it to persist, and then create those conditions wherever you went, and the forest built itself. The ground was warm under her palms. She stayed there for a long time. Behind her, she heard footsteps, George, she thought, from the weight of them, and then quiet. He had come to stand near her without intruding on whatever she was doing. This was one of the things she had come to rely on, his ability to be present without requiring anything of the presence. After a while she said, without turning, "We need to map the network's current coverage. Full survey. I want to know where the edges are and where the density is lowest before we start the next expansion phase." "I know," George said. "I already started." Of course he had. She pressed her palms a little harder against the ground, felt the cold and the salt and the faint not quite vibration of something moving through water and root, carrying signals in a language she had spent 2 years learning to amplify and still did not fully understand, because you could spend a lifetime learning what a forest said and still only have the outline of it, the way you can learn a country's language and still not know what the land remembers. But you could learn enough. You could learn enough to make a connection, to introduce two things to each other that had never known they were the same kind of problem. To stand in the center of a spiral someone else had planted and say, "The ground has something to tell you, and it has been saying it for a long time, and you walked into range of it, and now it is said." The Sioux moved in the morning wind. New growth, pale and unhardened, reaching upward in the particular unreasonable way that growing things reach. Not because they had assessed the probability of success, not because conditions were optimal, not because anyone had given them permission. Just because the conditions allowed it. Just because that was what they did. The years after had a texture that was different from the years before, and Mara sometimes tried to describe the difference and usually failed. Before, urgency and grief, the compressed grief of people who didn't have time to fully feel it, layered over the methodical work of keeping alive. After, something slower. Not peace, peace was the wrong word, too final, too resolved. Something more like the quality of attention that a plant gives to growing. Present, incremental, not looking too far ahead. The Veth didn't leave. She had never expected them to. Their operational investment in Earth was too significant to abandon over one anomalous event, and Mara understood their logic well enough by now to know that a Veth command cast did not recalibrate strategy on the basis of a single data point. What they did instead was pause. Their substrate extraction in the southeastern corridor decreased by roughly 60% over the 4 months following the Alpha King's visit to Altona. The command cast in the region began, as she had described in her message to the survivor networks, engaging in behavior that the Veth operational models could only interpret as subordinate dysfunction, and which the human observer network eventually started calling, simply, listening. They were listening, or something close enough to listening that the distinction might not matter. The survivor network spent considerable time debating what to do with this. There were arguments, many of them, carried through the fragile relay connections that George and his counterparts in other communities had been building and rebuilding for years. Arguments about whether Mara's work could be replicated reliably. Arguments about whether reliable replication would be enough to meaningfully change the terms of the occupation. Arguments about whether the goal should be to drive the Veth off the planet entirely, which Mara noted privately was not something the network could accomplish, and was not what she had built it for. Arguments about who had authority to make decisions for the surviving human population, which was the kind of argument that humans could apparently generate indefinitely, even when the surviving human population was approximately 2% of what it had been. She participated in some of these discussions and declined others. The ones she participated in were the ones about the science, about replication and expansion, and the specific soil chemistry conditions that the consortium required, and where those conditions existed across the continent. The ones she declined were the ones about authority. George, who managed the communications from Altona, and filtered a significant amount of what came through before it reached Mara, became skilled at sorting them. You have 43 messages from 7 different groups asking for you to come speak to their leadership, he told her one evening, sitting on the concrete step outside the treatment building where she did a lot of her thinking. What did you tell them? That you're busy, he paused, which is true. What did they say to that? Most of them said they understood. 2 of them said they needed your expertise specifically. One of them sent a follow-up asking whether they could send someone here to learn the methodology and take it back. Mara looked at the spirals. The Sioux were losing the season's growth now, the flush of new shoots having hardened into mature foliage over the months since the Alpha King's visit. The forest looked from the outside much as it had always looked, scrubby, wind-bent, unremarkable, the kind of thing you drive past. The last one, she said. Yes to the last one. I'll tell them. Tell them to send someone who's good at small things, someone who can work slowly. She thought of Demi, who had gone north but was still in contact, still sending data, his handwriting now recognizable in the chemical notation of soil sample reports from 100 kilometers away. Someone who understands that the work takes as long as it takes. George nodded. I know someone, a few someones actually. The first students arrived in spring. 3 of them, a soil scientist from what remained of the Adelaide corridor, a young woman named Fatima who had been a forestry student before the occupation, and who brought with her notebooks so dense with information they were difficult to read, and an older man whose preoccupation career had been in wastewater treatment, and who had, therefore, a practical understanding of the Altona site's particular soil chemistry that proved immediately useful. Mara taught them the way she had learned everything she knew, by doing, by failing, by doing again. She was not a natural teacher in any formal sense, but she had Priya to handle the classroom parts. Priya had developed, over the months of working together, a gift for explaining the consortium's biology in terms that non-specialists could follow, and she focused herself on the field work, on the things that could only be conveyed through practice. The feel of the soil when the consortium was established and when it wasn't, the specific smell of healthy mycorrhizal growth, the way you could tell by the color of new root growth whether the chemical environment was right, the patience that was not optional, not a personality trait but a technical requirement. You could not rush the network. You could only prepare the conditions and wait. Demi, who came back south for a month during the student's second season, sat with Fatima in the lab for 3 days and transferred his bacterial culture methodology to her with a thoroughness that Mara found quietly affecting. He was 19 now, and he had the quality of someone who had become exactly the person they were going to be, through conditions that had required it of him earlier than expected. He and Fatima exchanged notebooks before he left and continued corresponding through the relay, a scientific collaboration carried over improvised radio through a partially occupied planet. The network expanded. Not dramatically, not in any way that showed up from outside as a significant event. The consortium cultures went north with the students and were established in new sites, each chosen by the same criteria that had led Mara to Altona: low VETH extraction priority, existing native vegetation, suitable soil chemistry for the consortium to colonize. In each site, the establishment period was different. The Adelaide soil required a different approach than the southeastern coast, and the inland sites had water table characteristics that demanded significant modification of the protocol. But in each site, given enough time and enough care, the network established, connected across distances that no individual plant root system could span, carried through subsurface pathways of fungal thread and water gradient, the signal spread. Not to anywhere it wasn't planted. Not magically, just to wherever the conditions were right and someone had done the work to make them right. The VETH operational maps, read through the imperfect translation systems the survivor networks had developed, began showing something that had no category in VETH strategic modeling: zones of voluntary avoidance. Not avoidance because the substrate was depleted or the extraction logistics were unfavorable. Avoidance that appeared to be, as best as the translators could determine, a behavioral preference. The command cast in those zones were choosing to be elsewhere, not commanded to be elsewhere, choosing. This was, in VETH terms, irrational. In Mara's terms, it made complete sense. You did not stay in a place where you felt something you could not classify. You did not linger in the signal of something that your entire neural architecture told you was dominant, but that had no apex, no face, no position in any hierarchy you understood. You did not keep pressing your sensory filaments into ground that answered back with something you had no language for. You moved away, you found substrate that was silent. And the more of the land that spoke, the less substrate there was. She found out about the first VETH departure from the Adelaide sector through George, who had it from 3 separate relay connections by the time he told her. A substrate processing unit, not command cast, a working unit of 47 organisms, had packed their equipment and left the sector, not for a new extraction site, not for operational redeployment. The VETH signal monitoring system that the survivor networks had built over years of patient effort showed them moving toward the primary orbital processing station, the VETH's main transit hub, the place they went when they were done with a location. They were done with a location that still had mineral substrate to process, with a location that was, by every VETH operational metric, worth additional extraction time. They left because the ground told them to. "It's starting," Priya said when Mara told her. Mara thought about Agnes Deans pressing seeds into saline soil in 1998 and coming back to find half of them dead and pressing more seeds in. She thought about the 17 years between the original planting and the restoration effort, and the slow, expensive work of coming back to something that should have been abandoned and choosing to continue it anyway. "It's been starting for 25 years, she said. "We're just at the part where you can see it." She walked the outer spiral late in the evenings when the light was going, and the temperature dropped toward the kind of cold that the coast produced at this latitude in autumn. She had been walking it for years now, this specific path, the outermost ring of the outermost spiral, and the path had been worn into the grass by her feet and the feet of the students who had come through. A track that had not been there when she arrived and that would outlast her. The kind of mark that bodies make on a place when they return to it regularly. The kind of mark that was the oldest form of record-keeping, older than language. She thought sometimes about what record she was making, what the 1,000 days version of her and the 1,000 after days version of her would look like, from the perspective of whatever came next. Whether what she had done would be legible to the people who came after, or whether it would be the kind of thing that you could only understand if you had been there, in the dark, with your palms against the ground. She hoped it would be legible. She spent considerable effort making it legible. The papers she wrote with Priya, the methodology documents she dictated to Fatima, who typed them up with the same density of notation she brought to everything, the lab notebooks that would go into whatever archive survived. But she understood that something always escaped the record. That the feel of the soil when the consortium was right, the specific quality of knowing that the network was healthy, the thing she called listening, and that she could not explain to anyone who had not developed it themselves, that would not be in any document. That would have to be taught the way she had learned it. By failing, by doing again. By pressing your palms against the ground in the dark and waiting for the ground to answer. It always did. She had come to trust this completely, the way she trusted few things completely. The ground, given the right conditions, given the patient invisible work of the organisms that lived in it, and the roots that reached through it, and the signals that traveled in water and chemistry from root to root across distances no individual organism could span, the ground answered. Not in words, not in any language that had a grammar or a dictionary. In the oldest language, the one that predated language, the one that was not communication so much as it was communion, I am here, I am alive, come be part of what is alive. The Sioux moved in the evening wind. She stopped on the outer edge of the last spiral and stood still and listened, not to anything specific. To the quality of silence that a living place has, which is not silence at all, which is full of things too small or too distributed to be heard as separate sounds, which resolves, if you wait long enough and pay the right kind of attention, into something that is not quite a voice and not quite a feeling and is closest, she had always thought, to the experience of understanding something. The network was out there, 40, 60, 100 kilometers by now, spreading through soil that the consortium found hospitable, connecting the plantings that the students and their students had established, routing signals in its ancient patient way from root to root through the water table, talking to everything it touched in the only way it knew how. The VETH were in it, had been in it for years. Whether they knew this in any way that mapped to human knowing was a question she had stopped trying to answer, because the answer didn't matter. What mattered was what they did, and what they did, increasingly, was leave. one sector at a time, one substrate unit at a time, one slow, inexplicable choice at a time, by organisms that had no framework for voluntary retreat, but that kept making it anyway, kept turning toward the orbital station, kept departing from ground that told them in the oldest language that they were part of something that did not need their extraction, that it would outlast them, that the roots were older than their empire, and the network was deeper than their processing could reach, and the Earth, this specific stubborn, battered living Earth, was connected in ways their models had not accounted for, and would not account for because some things were not modelable, were only livable, were only knowable from the inside, from the press of a sensory filament against soil that had been speaking for millions of years before anyone arrived to hear it. She pressed her palms against the ground one more time. Cold, salt, damp, alive. The ground answered. It always did.